to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. In this episode, our second Silmarillion Q&A, we're going to discuss why elves have a concept of inheritance in the first place, where we go to find the deep lore on the Lady of Lothlórien, the political landscape of some unknown distant land called the Shire, and the absolutely correct and objective power rankings of the Valar. Before we get to those great questions, a quick apology for the delay in the release of this particular episode. As I mentioned at the end of last week's show, we migrated Stars and Swords to a new, more stable and faster podcast host, which will coincidentally allow us to release longer episodes without really running up our bandwidth bill too much. And kicking the tires took a little longer than anticipated. Everything seems to be working now, but if you're having trouble accessing older episodes of the show in your podcast app, I know that Pocket Casts, which was previously my favorite podcast app, was having some trouble reading the old feed, then try clearing the cache on your device and resubscribing. I apologize for the inconvenience caused, but as I say, now we can do more in this feed without receiving just a terrible bill at the end of every month. With all that said, let's get into the questions then, beginning with Travis, who writes with, 3 quick points, only one of which I'm going to disagree with, and then a question. Travis writes, 1. Feanor sucks. 2. Fingolfin, kind of a Mary Sue. 3. Ride or die for Tukas, always and forever. And 4. My actual question. If Finwë was the first death ever, resulting in the first instance of a question of succession ever, why would Feanor's ascension to king be assumed? Presumably this was not something that would have been planned for. It's not like there was a tradition of familial inheritance to draw on. I know from a Doyleist perspective, Tolkien is drawing on medievalist traditions of divine right to rule and the familial tradition inherent in that, but from a Watsonian perspective, there's no reason I can come up with why the Noldor in-universe, where this is the first time that this has ever happened and where there's no expectation for this being something that would ever need to be dealt with, would heed to a patrilineal succession of title, particularly when Feanor sucks, and Fingolfin is right there already ruling successfully. Travis, a fantastic question, and one that I honestly hadn't ever considered before, which I think is actually the point, right? This is proof of ideology in the truest sense. This is something that's so self-evidently obvious, asterisk, so deep in our personal sense of how the world works that we don't stop to question it. From the medieval period, most notably in terms of English history from the Norman conquest of 1066, most of the kingdoms of Europe functioned according to the rules of primogeniture, and the throne would pass to the eldest son of the king. This is, strictly speaking, agnatic primogeniture, with the line of succession passing through sons, as opposed to cognatic primogeniture or male preference primogeniture, in which a woman can inherit, though only in the case that there are no men left alive to inherit. This has been the rule in my native Scotland since the medieval period, and absolute primogeniture, in which the eldest child inherits regardless of gender, which is a fairly recent innovation, but has spread rather successfully through the great thrones of Europe. It was implemented by Sweden in 1980, and other European monarchies, through to the United Kingdom, which formally switched to absolute primogeniture in 2015, only, hundreds of years too late. The reason that primogeniture becomes so important during the feudal period is that it encourages social stability, because holdings aren't, as they were previously, parceled up between all the children of the deceased person, but rather they pass as a single unified block to the eldest, which is important when we're thinking of the lines of responsibility and authority so important to the feudal system. So this gives us a predictable continuity of rule. Succession crises aren't good for an ordered, stable, hierarchical society, as well as the encouragement of younger sons to undertake careers in the church or in the military in order to carve out their own place in the world, providing a kind of dubious public service, right? Additionally expanding and stabilizing the host society. So we have this powerful tradition that's very effective in terms of perpetuating feudal rule and feudal order that's completely enfolded in our sense of how kings work and what kings represent. And it turns out that this holds true in Tolkien's world of elves too. And interestingly, this isn't something to which Tolkien was oblivious. In later Numenor, which we'll get a brief opportunity to talk about a few weeks from now, he does indicate that absolute primogeniture is adopted in the early Second Age. So this is a part of feudal rule that Tolkien is thinking through in terms of his secondary creation, but he is kind of begging the question as to whether or not inheritance would even be needed. What's most interesting here, though, I think, is how Tolkien operates inside of, or alongside of, or even, yes, outside of this Watsonian Doyleist model. For those who haven't encountered these terms before, they emerge from, of course, the Sherlock Holmes fandom, and are used as a shorthand to distinguish between the diegetic, that is, the things which exist inside of the fictional world, and the non-diegetic, that is, things which exist outside of the fictional world. Watson exists within the fiction, so he has explanations for Holmes's behavior which are similarly internal to the fiction. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle exists outside of the text, so he offers explanations outside of the fictional world. Watson notes that Holmes prepared a monograph on types of tread found on the soles of the boots of working men, which allows him to follow the footprints and find the culprit, right? You remember that great Sherlock Holmes story where he follows some footprints and finds a culprit. Doyle, meanwhile, presents his character with a puzzle and needs Holmes to solve that puzzle in order to progress with the plot. One is in fiction, diegetic. One is extra fiction, non-diegetic. This is frankly super useful as a means of framing out in-world explanations, to get to the lore, to get to the deep magic, and to distinguish those things from creative decisions. And more importantly still, if we're following in the footsteps of Bart and of Foucault, as we should be, the Doyleist perspective also clues us into those things which the author is including in the text without conscious thought. And this question of elven inheritance, of elven primogeniture, I think is a perfect example of something that has been enfolded into the fictional world without sufficient scrutiny or care. Tolkien is simply assuming a system of agnatic primogeniture because it's a part of his ideological schematic for how medieval worlds operate. And I'm making some big claims here, I know, but I have looked this last week into the supporting material and cannot find a moment when Tolkien clarifies the position on inheritance specifically, except to note in later materials, sometimes after centuries of leadership, some elven kings might step back and allow their sons to take the throne, but that is only kicking the question further down the road because we are still assuming that it is the role of the eldest son to inherit. So the Doyleist explanation here is Tolkien's ideology. The Watsonian explanation, kind of explanation in absence here, is that the elves are writing this book for the benefit of other elves, so they don't need to explain the system when they all know how it operates. Presumably there was some kind of constitutional implementation early in the development of these elven societies where we decided that eldest sons would inherit if it ever came down to it, or that happens right now with the death of Finwë and the Feanorian crisis. But it's difficult to determine exactly what protocol would even be then, because let's remember, Finwë, in effect, semi-abdicates his throne, or at least stops functionally ruling his people long before he is killed by Morgoth when Feanor is sent into exile in the first place. So it's complicated, and it's complicated in this case particularly because of Tolkien's habit, Tolkien's inclination to insert himself into the fictional frame of the story, right? Tolkien, the Arthur Conan Doyle figure, chooses to render a version of himself as Tolkien the Watson, a part of the documentary history of the text in front of us. That's all kind of falling out by the time that we get to the Silmarillion, but as I keep returning to in the series, the real and imaginary intertexts surrounding the Silmarillion were never far from Tolkien's thoughts. And there is also, I think, not to duck the question entirely, right? I think there is a connected conversation about greatness, about the qualities we seek in leaders throughout the Legendarium, and the irony that in most cases, of course, those qualities which best equip a person to lead are exactly the qualities which tempt the king toward pride or arrogance or corruption. Feanor is, on paper, the best person to lead the Noldor. Better even if we observe the letter of Tolkien's Feanorian superlatives throughout, right? Feanor is even better than Finwë was. And that's the tragedy. And it's such a part of Tolkien's worldview that it carries all the way through to the tragedy of Boromir. Greatness begets corruption. It is the humble that survive and can accomplish the greatest things. All of which is to say, I guess, that I don't really have a good answer or a really clear resolution, but I do think that it's a telling omission. I think it's a telling presumption on Tolkien's part to include this kind of very accessible, very immediate, and very familiar rules of succession. Certainly, it's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a good long while, and paying attention to how these things are enfolded and how they are potentially preempted as we move through the rest of the Silmarillion. Thank you so much, Travis, for another fascinating email. I will disagree with you just a little on Fingolfin. Stick around. We've got some Fingolfin action coming up in the next couple of chapters that I think might change your mind a little bit on him. But I obviously completely co-sign Feanor and Tukas and your opinions there too. Thank you so much for writing. Let's shift gears to a question with something, well, in one sense, more like a definitive answer, but a definitive answer that is no less disappointing, I promise you. This comes to us from Sarah, who writes, I'm reading the Silmarillion at last because I love Galadriel in Rings of Power and wanted more of her story, but it isn't here. Where should I go for the lore? Thank you so much for writing, Sarah. We do get a little more Galadriel in the Silmarillion, most notably in Chapter 15. We get a full conversation with her, in effect. We get this is the chapter of the Noldor in Beleriand, but you are right. There's not as much about the Lady of Lothlórien, the Lady of the Galathrim, as we might expect, and that's because, unlike much of the Legendarium, Galadriel shows up for Professor Tolkien in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. He doesn't know her until he meets her. He's sketching Lothlórien in an early draft and speculating on the page about the Lord and the Lady who live there, as well as speculating that the Lady of Lothlórien might rule alone and might even, in fact, be the wife of Elrond of Rivendell. And it's clear from his notes that he understands, even in that moment, he understands Galadriel to be of the Noldor. And in the appendix, he stitches her into the family tree, but he's never quite satisfied with his understanding of this truly incredible character, one of these Tolkien women, right? Who shows up, takes charge, resists the ring, a truly phenomenal action, and grants the Fellowship gifts that guide them through the rest of their journey. In fact, he continues to work on Galadriel's story throughout the rest of his life, including in the weeks before his death in 1973. Christopher Tolkien speculates that a letter describing unfinished parts of Galadriel's story was the last thing that the professor wrote for the Legendarium. Christopher also notes, somewhat tellingly, quote, there is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, end quote. So early in his work on her backstory, Tolkien was so taken with Galadriel that he likened her to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Later, he emphatically rejected that comparison, but it is still a useful metric, I think, to measure how important she was in Tolkien's understanding of Middle-earth and in the developments in the Legendarium that come about after The Lord of the Rings is written and published. So most of the raw material that we have for Galadriel is found in the Unfinished Tales, in a chapter entitled, quote, The History of Galadriel and Celeborn and of Amroth, King of Lorien, end quote, but even the selection that Christopher Tolkien has arrayed there is still wildly incomplete and even internally contradictory, because unfortunately, we just don't have a finished version of Galadriel's story. And further still, the version of Galadriel's story that we get in the Silmarillion isn't even based on the latest and most developed of the professor's work, but on earlier, more complete, but perhaps less comprehensive versions of the story. According to Douglas Kane's book, Arda Reconstructed, Christopher even edits some of the descriptions of Galadriel to make her less impressive, removing references to her legendary valor. So Galadriel remains, sadly, something of an enigma, and the version of the character we get on the TV show is pretty fundamentally incompatible, though at least, as far as I've seen, is a pretty solid, pretty fantastic character in her own right. So thank you so much for the question, Sarah. I wish I had a more complete answer. Maybe someday someone will be able to go through all of Tolkien's work again and compile a fuller, more comprehensive history of Galadriel and, obviously to a much lesser extent, Celeborn too. Thanks so much for the question, Sarah. Let's get back to the politics of Middle-earth with this question from Stuart, who writes, I loved your discussion of medievalism in the last Q&A episode, and I feel like I finally understand why kings are so important, capital S, capital I, in Tolkien's worldview. You're right, it feels like the opposite of the American experience. My question is this. If Tolkien is a medievalist and the Shire is supposed to be his perfect vision of England, why doesn't the Shire have a king? This is so great, Stuart. Thank you so much for writing in with this question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about something I've been thinking about a lot lately, actually, namely Tolkien's personal politics, particularly later in life. Before we get to that specifically, let's give the Watsonian answer, right? The Shire is settled in the middle of the Third Age, and at that time it is geographically a part of Arthedain, one of the remnant Dunedain realms which remain after the Civil War. Interestingly, and appropriately to this discussion, that civil war was a consequence of a succession crisis after the death of the king of Arnor, in which time that country is split into 3 different kingdoms. So the hobbits get permission from the king of Arthedain to settle in the area, and that's basically it. They are theoretically under the rule of that king for 300 years until Arthedain falls. At that point, They have no king, technically speaking, until Aragorn, who crucially doesn't reincorporate the Shire into his kingdom formally, but rather protects it as an independent enclave, takes the throne back and reunites the kingdoms of North and South. Which means that the Shire continues to operate politically just as it had for 1,500 years prior. A hereditary position, the Thane, exists to lead the hobbits in times of war and open conflict, though obviously that means the position is mostly ceremonial. At the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, this is Paladin Took. Paladin Took is the Thane of the Shire. This is Pippin's dad. Pippin himself will become the Thane of the Shire in the 13th year of the Fourth Age. After serving for 50 years, Pippin will then depart the Shire for Gondor in the company of Merry and pass the position of Thane onto his son, Faramir Took. So this is an inherited position. But it's not the only political figure in the Shire. We have, frankly, a much more important figure, the Mayor of Mickledelving, or the Mayor of the Shire, which is an elected position primarily dedicated to maintaining the civil infrastructure of the Shire, right, such as it is, the roads, the sheriffs, the postal service. But it's mostly concerned with presiding over feasts and festivals. The most famous Mayor of Mickledelving, of course, Samwise Gamgee, who serves for 7 7-year terms. So this very simple, very direct, very close to the ground, very hobbitish political structure is contrasted, is opposed very directly in the closing movement of The Lord of the Rings with the authoritarian tyranny that we see demonstrated by Sharky, that is, Saruman, during the scouring of the Shire. Not only are the hobbits only nominally under the authority of the king, their own government is as minimal as it can possibly be, minimal to the point of being almost entirely ceremonial. One of the things that we see happen immediately after the scouring of the Shire is over is a reduction in the number of sheriffs back to their pre-scouring levels, because the less intrusive this civil infrastructure is, the happier the hobbits of the Shire are. So from this, I think we really can begin to distinguish between Tolkien the medievalist and Tolkien the 20th century man, who are similar in that they believe in individualism, they believe in the awesomeness of kings, and they absolutely do not believe in the machinery of government. The clearest proof of this, though, again, this is one of these things that you can see everywhere you look in Tolkien's work. You can see it in the Shire, you can see it in Bree, you can see it in Rohan, you can see it in Gondor, but the clearest and most unambiguous expression of this comes from a letter that the professor wrote to Christopher in November of 1943. Quote, "My political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs, or to unconstitutional monarchy. I would arrest anybody who uses the word state in any sense other than the inanimate realm of England and its inhabitants, a thing that has neither power, rights, nor mind, and after a chance of recantation, execute them if they remained obstinate. If we could get back to personal names, it would do a lot of good. Government is an abstract noun, meaning the art and process of governing, and it should be an offense to write it with a capital G, or so as to refer to people. If people were in the habit of referring to King George's council, Winston and his gang, it would go a long way to clearing thought and reducing the frightful landslide into theocracy. Anyway, the proper study of man is anything but man, and the most improper job of any man, even saints who, at any rate, are at least unwilling to take it on, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." End quote. So we can see here a belief, yes, in a natural order of rule, the unconstitutional monarchy, right? The king that is an absolute and uncontested authority in his land, because Tolkien still believes that noble kings are good things. But there's also this tension with this world of personal liberty and responsibility unfettered by the machineries and the systems of government. This is what we see at work in the Shire. We shouldn't, of course, extend this too far, because Tolkien may be arguing in favor of a friendly country garden kind of anarchism, but he is also envisioning a world of social stratification along the lines of class. There are wealthy hobbits and there are poor hobbits. In the most generous reading, we can understand the Shire and, by extension, Tolkien's vision of an English utopia to be one of comfort and ease and a soft kind of personal liberty, bounded only by the common sense of the community and the autonomous action of good-hearted individuals to exercise their own judgment. It's a fairy tale, and it doesn't scale at all. But frankly, I would take this to be a feature rather than a bug, because Tolkien's social philosophy demands small communities which are tight-knit but functionally independent. We can see this in the way that Tolkien thinks about and argues against imperialist adventures. In another letter to Christopher, this time written in 1945, he writes, quote, Though in this case, as I know nothing about British or American imperialism in the Far East that does not fill me with regret and disgust, I am afraid I am not even supported by a glimmer of patriotism in this remaining war. I would not subscribe a penny to it, let alone a son, were I a free man." End quote. Thus we can see his disillusionment with the transformation of the nation of England into the state of England, which is one of the reasons I would argue that the Shire is so softly defined. It's given little to no formal leadership. It is about individuals. It is about people with names. The hobbits are left to their own devices. Tolkien is suspicious of machinery, the machinery of government, at least as much as the machinery of industry. It's perhaps a little insubstantial as a political philosophy. It doesn't give me what I want in terms of social mobility and justice, for example, but it is at least good-hearted. It is truly conservative, and it is not destructive. The truth is, as we see in the books, that if the Shire is all there is, the Shire would be just fine. It's in the larger movements of the world that the Shire finds itself in friction and in conflict. So thank you so much for your question, Stuart. I hope that has gone some way toward explaining my perspective, at least on how the Shire operates politically and why the Shire operates the way it does. If you guys have questions or further thoughts on this or on any of the topics that we're discussing in this week's session, please do get in touch with me. You can email me directly, starsandswordspod@gmail.com, or you can find all the other links over on the website, starsandswords.com. One last question then, this time from Yavanna, who I can only assume is really Yavanna, because who else would dare imitate Queen of the Earth, the giver of fruits? Yavanna writes simply, "Rank the Valar!" ! Worst to best! ! Which, I mean, sure, why not? Who am I? Who among us could resist the command of Yavanna herself? I don't know that I have any big surprises in store here. I don't think that I'm really going to astonish anyone who has been listening to my discussion of the Silmarillion thus far. I think let's maybe go with letter grades just to split it up a little bit. C-tier Valar. The last should probably be Vanna, the ever-young, the wife of Orome, because nobody really knows what she does while he is gallivanting around hither and yon all over Middle-earth slaying monsters. And I'm not saying there's nothing bad about Vanna. There's just nothing at all about Vanna, really. So she kind of has to default to the bottom of the list. Also C-tier, probably Nessa, the dancer, the wife of Tukas. I might throw in Este the Gentle, and if I'm including Este, this is harder. I'm probably going to include Lorien too. I think that they would be happy together in the C-tier. I think they can comfort one another and really restore their bodies and souls after this crushing disappointment of being ranked by a guy with a podcast. It's admirable work running Healing Gardens, but this is a tough bracket. In all honesty, this might be the shocking one. Honestly, maybe I have one shocking opinion left in me, and it might be this. I think that Manwë is a C-tier Valar. I think that Manwë is just not very interesting, and we get so many more words telling us how awesome he is rather than demonstrating how awesome he is. Although, well, now I'm reconsidering because I'm remembering how much I love his conversation with Yavanna at the end of Chapter 2 of Ale and Yavanna. So here's what we'll do. We will make him C+, I think. B tier, Orome, for sure. I don't have a lot for Orome, but he's kind of undeniably active and at least contributes to some of the spark of Middle-earth, even in his earliest appearances. Varda, who is great, and I love the stars, but isn't terribly present within the frame of Arda. Vere, though... Vere's a tough one because she basically doesn't appear at all in the Silmarillion, but her domain, her power, the weaving the tapestries of the history of Middle-earth to bedeck the halls of Mandos is maybe the coolest aspect of, well, the second coolest aspect of the Valyrian Legendarium here. I really love that as a means of accounting for history. B+ maybe for Ulmo, who is a solid utility player, but from whom I think I always want a little more, and who also, lets Osei and Weenan take some of his screen time. He could be more present, more active in some of those stories too. That leaves us A tier as what? Mandos, definitely A tier. I find Mandos so entertaining every time he opens his mouth, every time he shows up on the page. I think he is fantastic. I love that little nerdy theater kid. Ale and Yavanna as a paired set, I think you absolutely have to. Nienna, who supersedes Vere because Nienna is the most interesting thing about Tolkien's pantheistic approach here. And of course, champion of the Valar, greatest in strength and deeds of prowess. Who else but Tukas Astaldo, who is just fantastic and who I love very deeply every time he shows up. So that's I'm writing this down as I go. 5 C tier, 4 B tier, 5 A tier. Okay, so what we're going to do is Owlay. We're going to bump Owlay down to B tier, to B plus, I think. That gives us 5 in C tier, 5 in B tier, and 4 in A tier. That seems to me to be fair. Do you agree, dear Silmarillionaires? Do you want to speak in support of Manwë? Does anyone have a doom to offer to me or to Manwë or to Mandos here? Please do get in touch. As I say, you can email me directly at starsandswordspod@gmail.com or come chat on Blue Sky, which is, like its tagline should tell us, like Twitter, only good, at starsandswordspod@bsky.social. That is going to do it for the short and sweet Q&A. I will be back on Thursday, March 27th at 8 p.m. Central Time. If you would like to head out live, head over to the Patreon page at patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free, and that will get you the link to every single week's live session. So you can come and hang out in the chat, which is always a good time. I think, better yet, pledge a little financial support over there. Help me keep making podcasts. Help me keep making longer podcasts now that I have the space on our podcast host to do so. And you'll get a bushel full of bonus episodes for all the Next Word shows. You'll get a weekly live bonus show called Made It Through Monday, which is a blast to record. I sit down and record that with Elizabeth at the end of every Monday evening just to kind of, start the week right and catch up. We also have, at the $8 tier over on the Patreon, you can elect to receive in your actual real-life mail an 8-page zine, including reviews and recommendations and fiction and poetry, and coming in the first installment later this month, a genre fiction crossword puzzle, which I am very, very proud of. All of that at patreon.com/nextword. I'm so very grateful for your support. A deep thank you to Travis and to Sarah and to Stuart and to Yvonne for your brilliant questions. That'll do it for this week's episode. I will talk to you all again on Thursday with chapters 13 and 14, or at least as much of chapters 13 and 14 as we can cover before my voice gives out entirely. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Good night.